must stop it. The way that we're going to be doing this in today's debate is that where individuals leave their money after their death, either to individuals in their family on their basis of their race, for example, siblings or adoptive children that have different race, and they make clear that that's the reason that they've done that, we would ban them from doing that if it can be proven to a civil standard. The second thing we would also stop is giving specifically to racial groups, specific ethnic charities, and that spend their money only on one particular community, because we think that perpetuates inequality more broadly. We're going to take that money, put it into a in the case of like families, redistribute it amongst the members of the family based on need, and in the case of the charitable acts to other groups, we're going to put that into a consolidated revenue fund and give that charity money based on need as well, because that's how we think we can spend it best. Prime Minister, I'm going to tell you, firstly, why it's the role of the state to intervene in this way. Secondly, how allowing the status quo to continue perpetuates inequality. And thirdly, about what this does for discriminatory messages in our society. The first argument I want to bring is that this is the role of the state to intervene in these cases. And what we see is that, like, when you die, your rights are changed at that point. You have fewer rights when you die because you're not then directing your own money for your own benefit. We see that already under the status quo, when the government protects wider societal interests by levying an estate tax, so that you don't have absolute rights that show like how your money is going to be spent after you die. There are wider societal things to be protected. We see that already under the status quo, but there is a reallocation and distribution of resources in progressive taxation and welfare, because we recognise that certain inequalities in society need to be redressed. The second reason that this is a role of the state is to protect against discrimination. And we see this in the instance of anti-discrimination in employment, where even if an employer thinks it is in their interest to discriminate and not hire someone based on race, because, for example, customers of that business might hold racist attitudes and they want to maximise their own self-interest by not pissing those customers off. We see that society and the government, therefore, have a wider interest in preventing those competing interests from resulting in people being disadvantaged because of their race, because you do not choose your race, and it is unfair then to be discriminated against on that basis. And I'll take opening.
From 1850 to now, the only reason lots of young black people in the southern United States got educated at tertiary level is because they went to black colleges that were endowed by single black wealthy individuals. Would you stop that?
Look, we think that black people overwhelmingly have had worse access to education in the United States, despite the fact that several wealthy black individuals had given their money to that charity. If you'd done what we wanted and taken every white and black person's money that wanted to be racist to the most needy to begin with, and they would have been lifted out of poverty a whole lot earlier. Second argument I want to bring is just that, why this model prevents the inequality that has been perpetuated by the status quo. And what we say at Opening Government is that the status quo is one that protects entrenched interests. It protects the people that have the racial groups that have the most money to pass on and that allocate it on the basis of that. We argue that the funds should be allocated not based on your preference or your identification, but based on need. The reason for this is that when you aggregate the effect of individuals maximising their own self-interest by proving how proud they are of their ethnic group and giving money on the basis of that, what it does is it normalises giving money to charity on the basis of your ethnicity. That is a problem because necessarily there will be people of different races that deserve that money more, and the worst funded schools will continue to be the worst funded schools, and the best will continue to be the best. We would point to examples like the fact that the caste system in India indicates that where people identify strongly with a certain ethnic group and change the way that they treat people on the basis of that ethnic group, the members of other classes and lower castes are particularly disadvantaged and will continue to go to the worst schools. Secondly, we say that this also has an effect within particular families. We say that, like, we think it's a very incredibly rare case that parents would prefer members of their family of one ethnicity or another. But where it happens, we think that it's bad enough that they might have advantaged the people of the race that they prefer during their lifetime, and it's not. We want to stop that now, and the state should intervene to say that now that they're dead, that's not fair. That the individuals that have had like access to worse health and education, because that's how the person wanted to spend their money when they're alive, now need the support of the state because they are needier than the other siblings who you're going to give the massive house under the status quo. Last argument I want to look at in today's debate is what this does for the message of discrimination in society. And we say that, like, although some people might want to do it like on the basis of like saying that their ethnicity is good, inherent in that is saying that your ethnicity or racial group is superior in some way to others, that they are inferior and less deserving of that money. So allowing that person to do what they want with their property has resulted in a racist statement that devalues the people of the race that they've decided to cut out of their will, and that has an incredibly harmful and pernicious effect. Because when people see people give money to charity on the basis of their ethnicity, that becomes normalized in people's minds, that they think that that's legitimate, and there's a message that people are inferior then because they're not given that support. The second thing this does for the message of discrimination is result in less racial tension, because we think when despite a few cases of rich black individuals giving money, we think that when it's overwhelmingly rich white individuals in the US that are giving money to their Ivy League colleges, we think that creates resentment amongst the races and ethnic groups that are left out. That increases racial division in the society, and every black person and every white person sees themselves less of their common humanity and tends to define themselves more on the basis of their race as a result of that, which can only make people angry given the continuing disadvantage of African Americans in the US. Ladies and gentlemen, this leaving money to one ethnic group in your will is a disgusting statement that harms people's access to basic health and education. We must stop it.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for his remarks and invite the Leader of the Opposition to approach the front and open the case for sign-off.
Ladies and gentlemen, the year is not 1900, and the number of people prepared to give scholarships just to white people is so vanishingly low that we think it's probably can be rounded down, since I'm going to be a management consultant soon, to about zero. The number of people that come from a specific type of disadvantage based exclusively or somewhat on their race is enormous, and preventing that vanguard of successful shining stars from being able to endow their wealth to a community that they feel close to, that assisted them throughout their lives, and that needs their help is absolutely perverse. And that is precisely what these people are doing. So 3 things in rebuttal. Firstly, the role of the state. Secondly, inequality. Thirdly, racism. Firstly, the role of the state. We heard about the estate tax. The principle behind the estate tax is this. Every person gets something from society, and thus they have to give back to society in some portion of that. That's the whole principle behind tax. But once we have determined what each person has gotten out of society, the rest of their will and the rest of their estate is by definition something created by their own work, by their own interests, and by their own motivations, and ought to be freely available to be given as they please. Secondly, in terms of perpetuating inequality, almost none of this goes to white people. Almost none of this goes to advantaged races in our society. And we can tell that that happens because the motivations for people are those charitable ones of wanting to give to a disadvantaged community. They're people like Joanna Lumley, who's part Gurkha and is proposing to give her entire will back to supporting the causes of Nepalese people. They're people like people who give to grants like Howard University. There are people like black graduates from Harvard who want more black graduates from Harvard in the future because, like, all of these white people who they think are going to be giving white scholarships, in fact, just pay for their kids to go to Harvard in future. They said we'd get more money from this because apparently people wouldn't change their wills when the laws changed. Firstly, they'll just give the money to their family, and so you're just redirecting money back to them. Secondly, they won't want to give their money to causes like this if there isn't that motivation of that specific charitable interest. They presume that that charitable interest was general, and most often it's not. Why are we okay with this money sometimes going to white people? Firstly, because we find it impossible to craft a law which said that you could only give it to people of a particular race if that race was not Caucasian. Secondly, because we think the benefits are far outweigh. And thirdly, because we think that even where this does go to people who aren't specifically disadvantaged, the testamentary freedom that rests on you feeling closer to a particular community should outweigh that. Finally, on perpetuating racism, they said that this will sort of go, that this is behind, the idea behind this is that some people are less deserving. It's not. People don't give money to their families because they think their families are more deserving. It would be impossible for Rupert Murdoch to think that, for instance. They give it to them because they feel closer to them, and that feeling is utterly legitimate. And secondly, they most often are more deserving. People who have suffered disadvantage are more deserving of that kind of specific support. Secondly, we heard that it was normalising this. This is the status quo, and yet we all gasped when the topic came up, so I'm pretty sure this hasn't had much of an effect on our feelings. And thirdly, they talked about racial tension. We think that the idea of cutting off all black endowments is something that will create huge racial tension. So two things in substantive. Firstly, testamentary freedom, very briefly, and secondly, social goods. Firstly, people work hard for money. They work their entire lives for the money that they gain. And the whole of that principle of letting them give their wills to people demonstrates that having the motivation to work for that money means that the motivations behind working for that money should determine who gets it. So we think that when people might see themselves as members of a particular ethnic or cultural or racial community, and that that's one of the reasons why they work so hard, then they ought to have the right to give that money in the way that they want. But we also just think that this claims a subjective value judgment from government about whether race is important, which a whole raft of people just don't buy into, and claims that subjective value judgment from government over and above the real and actual judgment of those people who are earning the money. Secondly, what we'd say is the state already takes its cut from this and already determines what social goods could come from this, in the fact that it taxes people while they're alive, it taxes people while they are after death, and it limits the purposes of trusts in particular that can be perpetual, but doesn't necessarily limit the purposes of individual grants. So there are fewer ways that you can spend your money in terms of inheritances when you are spending it on just any cause whatsoever, or when you're spending it on trust, than there are when you do that. We already limit this greatly, and so we think this space where people have that freedom should still be there. Thirdly, what we'd say is that it is entirely legitimate for people to feel more close, to feel more affinity with people of their own race than they do with people of other races. That's precisely why we allow people to donate to members of their family, whether they be stupid, whether they be bald-headed, whether they be undeservedly dating a supermodel, than they do to the world at large, because people have connections and they have emotions. What are the kind of connections that you have with your race? You have connections of shared history, of shared culture, of shared understandings of the world. You have connections that often come from that particular racial group having assisted you to gain the money that you have in the past, often through programs like these kind of endowments. But you also often have the shared experience of disadvantage. African Americans, for instance, some of those African Americans, when they looked at Barack Obama, thought of him as not a real black person because he hadn't had this history of slavery in his family. We're agnostic on whether that's the case. We think that those particular people have the right to feel closer to people who have had the experience of slavery and disadvantage to others and direct their money in the way that they feel fit. No thanks. Secondly, on social goods. This is a means to funnel money from small vanguards that get through largely unequal societies back to the whole of the rest of those groups that are disadvantaged in society. It's things like, I'll take you on one second. It's things like the Howard College Endowment. It's things like Indigenous scholarships that are often the only method for people to go to university. Go ahead, Paul.
Tim, it is contradictory to say that white people just should spend all this money on white people when there's a life to get around our model, and then argue that all these massive harms accrue when African and billionaires can't give that in a way.
No, what I said is that Whitey will spend his money on, like, Whitey Jr. while he's alive. The first problem with this funneling money is that this prevents us from creating instruments of social mobility. We think race still plays a role in poverty, and that urban black areas, for instance, have much lower standards of education, so directing money towards education is crucial. The Bumiputra in Malaysia have particular problems, that Indigenous Australians have particular problems that absolutely relate to discriminatory societies they have to get through. Secondly, this is a way of correcting unequal government policy, because it limits the extent of dependence on government from these racial groups. Why? Number one, because it's often too difficult to give racially specific grants that recognise racial disadvantage from government, because other races feel resentful of policies on affirmative action, and this stops it from having to go through that. Secondly, because often minority groups don't have the political power to gain specific concessions recognising those being specifically disadvantaged. And thirdly, we think that often these grants go for things that are just way too extravagant for government to ever get the political power to support, but are really important, like a scholarship plus living expenses to go to Harvard, which would be laughed locked out of US Congress, which a powerful black millionaire can give to like lots and lots of other black kids in the future in a way that white parents are already doing to their children now. Thirdly, this redirects money away from families. We think the result of their model would only be that money would go directly to families who are still white, but just happen to be children of those people. And fourthly, we think there are some non-monetary goods from this, like George Bernard Shaw's grant to support the Welsh language, which supports a particular culture, which is particular to a certain type of race, expresses his opinion that that's a particularly important idea, and helps people to deal with those problems that have been created. This ignores people's freedoms to do what they want with money that they earn based on their motivations, and it ignores all the social goods they do when they do it. It absolutely must fall.
I would like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to complete the case for his side proposition.
Thank you, Madam Chair. An American billionaire, I've forgotten her name, left millions upon millions of dollars so that her cat would be well fed until the day it died. Like I imagine many people in this room, had an instinctual reaction that was an inappropriate use of their money. I also had a reaction that was a bit crazy. Just because people want to give their money a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that they achieve the kind of social good that it's the role of the state to ensure that money is instrumental in achieving. We deny that testamentary freedom, just because you like people, just because you may have shared a history with people from the same culture, one, exists to the extent in terms of sharing culture, and I'll deal with that in a minute, but two, is absolute. It's something that should just be respected by the state. Because we think in this case there is a pressing argument that the harms that obtain where you allow that freedom, and more specifically, the opportunity cost of not redressing a lot of those imbalances are such that it's time for the state to act. To do it quickly, with one argument in rebuttal, before I kind of integrate on this idea of what about minority to minority charity, before giving you my material, which is about the kind of thing that we can do within individual families by forcing families to interact with perhaps individuals in their family with whom they might not have interacted, and second of all, what the aggregated effect of that is across society and in terms of breaking down racial divide. Firstly, though, to deal with this idea of offence taken at government action, because Tim told us that people who see affirmative action policies given out by government, given out by individual universities, are likely to be offended by those, but they're less likely to be offended when they're the policies of individual black billionaires to individual black children. We just don't think that's true. To the extent that those people are going to be offended, we say that even if we buy all your arguments, those people are going to be just as offended and other individuals being lifted up by that kind of money. Why is it particularly important that it's the role of the state to get these kinds of policies up? There's a few reasons that minority to minority charity doesn't work. The first is that the numbers are invidious. Of the billionaires in the United States, you have to look a long way down the list, if indeed you can find one, to find someone who is black. We think the kind of quantities that you're talking about here, where you can give an endowment to Harvard University, and that's going to be perfectly fine, and Harvard can then allocate that according to need rather than necessarily according to race. So covering the people who come from educationally disadvantaged backgrounds rather than necessarily racially disadvantaged backgrounds is going to be something that is much more likely to happen now. To the extent that older white individuals are cutting out universities from their will on the basis they believe there are too many black people studying there, on the basis they believe they don't want it to be don't want that kind of social equity to obtain, we think that that is an important protection for those universities and those endowments to get access to those funds, which they otherwise would not have because that money would go elsewhere. We also lastly think that that exists at the margins of the call, right? We think that where someone wants to give an endowment to a university but wants to specify that it go to a certain race within that university, it's a marginal decision where they've made a decision to allocate $20 or $30 billion of the rest of their wealth, like someone like Warren Buffett. We think this is an important safeguard to ensure that the government can push them in the direction of making sure that we can maximise the utility of that wealth. The second thing that we say that wasn't engaged with by opening opposition is this allocation protects the neediest people in any one country. It protects those people who are most disadvantaged and make sure that disadvantage that is like redressed is that disadvantage of education, that disadvantage of a lack of funds. Where someone ticks all those boxes, we don't think it's necessary to go to their race to determine who should be receiving that funds and who should get that kind of equitable lift to get them to university. The last reason we think that it's a bad idea to go up on this is this idea of like transitional black wealth. So more black people are in the United States, and that means that money can flow back to the black community. We think two things happen. One is you cleave the divide between black universities and white universities. In a post-racial United States, there is nothing worse to send as a message than if you are black, you have to go to Howard, rather than if you're black, you have to go to Harvard when you're good enough. We think that we can't entrench that message of white people going to a particularly well-resourced university because it has a $30 billion endowment and a smaller university having to scrape by on the necessarily smaller funds. The last thing that ignores is that there are a huge swathe of the population not covered by the kinds of transitional wealth that you're talking about. So more disadvantaged than black Americans today are Hispanic Americans who share the same kind of one, ghettoized culture where they don't have access to that basic infrastructure that allows them to get to school. Who live in communities where they don't have access to those meaningful kind of school programs or education to kind of get them off the ground. It just so happens there just aren't that many Hispanic multi-millionaires in the United States. To the extent that we'd like to lift everyone out of that kind of disadvantage, we think it should be prioritised according to need and not according to race. It's not enough to wait for the next 50 to 100 years or 150 years in the experience of black people until we get enough Hispanic billionaires to do that. What's my material in this debate? First, Tim.
Why do you keep pretending that people will still put the money in their will to a racist cause and just let it go to the government, when in fact they're more likely to say, if I can't give it to the people I want to give it to, I'll give it to my family.
Yeah.
You're reducing the amount of money.
I've explained that, right? And we had two responses to this. One was Paul in the point of information, which is if we even buy your logic that people are going to give that while they're alive, there's no reason none of your model those black people aren't going to give it to all those people if we buy that in the first place. But this is the second thing that we'd say is we just don't think that that's necessarily going to happen. So the material I gave you a little while ago was this is pushing people at the margins of that call, right? Where people by and large make a decision before the fact to allocate that $30 billion to an endowment, and this is something that dictates the terms on which that allocation can be made. Why does this force integration within families? We think that oftentimes this happens at a micro level, where someone's son marries someone not of that ethnicity and they want to cut those people out of that will. When someone's daughter who is white marries a black person and they want to cut them out of that will on that basis. We think that that is patently offensive. I don't think anyone in this room would intuitively stand for the idea that's a nice thing to do. Why should they not have the right? Because where you force people to follow the interests of their estate, where you say to that person they cannot just cut off communication with that person, you force an interaction on a basic and micro level that means they're more likely to engage with someone from a different ethnicity. In an era where more and more people from different cultures are marrying within cultures, where the population of Australia is the next 60 years estimated to be by and large Eurasian, that is an important thing to promote because it gets over those kinds of ethnic tensions. India and a couple of states paid for the dowry of individuals to marry into other castes. That was a really, really powerful thing to do in breaking down a very, very entrenched social barrier between the kind of interaction that means a couple of things. One, it starts to alleviate those kinds of social disadvantages that subsist in individual castes because it gets rid of a lot of those other disadvantages. But two, it gets so much closer to what is functionally a post-racial society, where it is so much harder to link someone by virtue of the colour of their skin to the kind of disadvantage that they suffer. It does that on a micro level, but when aggregated, when you have that across 100 or 1,000 or 100,000 families, you make it more likely that that kind of view subsists in that society and more likely that they're open to that kind of interaction rather than having to cut them out of their will and not hear it again. Because it's an important policy, because it addresses disadvantage, we're proud to propose.
I would like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the deputy leader of the opposition to continue the case for opposition benches.
This side of the House isn't ending testamentary freedom of individuals broadly, it's limiting it insofar as people can give it to a specific race. So you're not reducing net inequality in society most likely. What you are doing is taking away money that is the just deserts of oftentimes the most impoverished, the most disadvantaged, and the most poorly off. Turning firstly to my rebuttal. First of all, what is the role of the state when it comes to testamentary freedom of individuals? This side of the House, insofar as they're only banning one portion of testamentary freedom, have to accept that that principle still exists. So no, it is not the role of the state, insofar as it has never existed before, to take all your money. This side of the House wanted to point to the death tax as a principal support for this argument. First of all, the death tax is only ever a portion of your income and of your estate, and only ever a very small one. By that same logic, my income tax is no longer about 5% of my income, but 100% of my income. We don't think that principle holds. But also, it's a hugely disputed policy. Most states don't have it. Those that do oftentimes get rid of it very, very quickly, and lots of people don't like it. So we're not happy for this side of the house to rely on that as a principle because it doesn't exist, and insofar as it does, a lot of people don't like it. Secondly, does this perpetuate inequality? We would say no, it does not, and historically, it corrects inequality. Why? First of all, because it recognises there are entrenched differences in society, oftentimes based entirely on race and your ethnicity, and it goes some way to correcting that when there are government limitations on doing so. Tim told you that it is vanishingly rare, either in the 1850s or now, that a white person distinguishes white people in their will. It just goes to people broadly. That should not be the bulk of this debate. The bulk of this debate should be scholarships that go to the booming culture in Malaysia and mean they can go to college wherever that is. That is black people in the southern United States. So it corrects inequality that exists elsewhere. This side of the house said, well, how much better off would black people have been if we'd done this in 1850? I'm not really sure it was a question of testamentary freedom that meant they were disadvantaged then. It was probably because they've been enslaved for hundreds and hundreds of years. We recognise we are having this debate in the here and now. We also think that they have to accept that the broad principle of testamentary freedom that they're upholding does this, because you're not going to get rid of the reality of the uber-rich in America and the UK and most of the Western world are an increasingly small, closed and increasingly rich class that are creating a functional dynasty of wealth in most Western states, and that's where a lot of social harm comes from, but they're doing it at the cost of people who are actually oftentimes quite poor. That's the problem with this side of the house. We told you that family testamentary freedom will still exist. And so insofar as people will rewrite their wills, they'll oftentimes say something like, I'm not giving it to my white child over my black child because they're white. I just like him more. That is entirely at their liberty to do under the model of this side of the house. Also, sometimes laws exist, particularly in developed states, that you do have to apportion things equally, whoever you are and whatever the race. So we're happy to rely on them in the circumstances where they exist. I've told you time and time again that this changes things. It doesn't make things worse for certain races who have historically discriminated against. It makes it better. This side of the house was unhappy with the idea that it may only affect the margins, that it may only affect people who can get to Harvard. First of all, that's a misrepresentation of a lot of wills because they go to broad community building, they go to PCYCs where all children can go, where all children can get off the streets, to drug programs, HIV/AIDS programs. But insofar as they only go to Harvard in their fantasy land, we still think it is a good thing that the black community and indeed the Hispanic community can produce shining stars that are role models to children in that community and that can themselves then give back to that community. We told you, and this part of our case got no response from Patrick, there are limits on government action to reduce inequality. What are they? Because oftentimes the majority doesn't want racially discriminatory policies that are positively racially discriminatory because they don't want black people getting their tax dollars. It's very hard. This side of the house conceded that accidentally when they said white people don't like it when black billionaires give their money away. Exactly. It's very hard for government to get that kind of corrective action. Also, a lot of things like building a college, like building a research centre into the causes of Hispanic poverty is really hard for government to do because it's quite extravagant. So, turning on to, does this perpetuate racism? No! Insofar as this is the status quo, we're not really sure this is sufficiently high on the public's awareness list to really change things all that much. It is a firstly because oftentimes legal confidentiality applies to these documents, right? But also, how much greater, Tim told you this, there was no response from Patrick, how much greater will the racial tension be when Howard College, a historically black college in the south of the United States, is told, we are taking away your $400 million endowment because it's racist, guys. That strikes me as something that will cause tension. I'll take the closing at any point. Go.
But in your attempt to reconstruct the political narrative on race in these developed countries, why do you want to perpetuate race-based politics?
Okay, well, we're not reconstructing it. We're advocating the status quo. There's no reconstruction going on. This is my substantive material. That it is bad in a society that not, as Patrick said, post-racial, that is not discrimination on the basis of race. It is bad to start ignoring race as a factor in disadvantage because it remains firmly so. This side of the house said we should allocate things to the neediest. This side of the house said we should distinguish on need. This side of the house said we're a post-racial society. We're not post-racial. And insofar as oftentimes need and a specific kind of need is allocated to a particular community, we think we should allow these policies. We imagine they're not going to, this side of the house is not going to stop wills that go to certain income brackets, certain geographic areas, and certain schools perhaps. But what it can't do go to certain races. What does that say? It says poverty is the same, or disadvantage is the same, or aggressive government policies are the same for everybody. I'm here to say that black and Hispanic poverty, the poverty of Bumi Putra in Malaysia, but the poverty of Indigenous Australians is different to the poverty of the majority. Why? Because it's oftentimes entrenched by ongoing drug problems, because it's entrenched by unemployment, because it's entrenched by things like a lack of medical and education. It's entrenched by discrimination from everybody else. We continue to see studies that see black candidates with a black name on the same CV don't get a job when someone with a white name has that CV. There is still ingrained racism in our society. So, why is it bad to start ignoring race as a factor in disadvantage and just say we should give it to everyone because it doesn't matter anymore, which is what this side of the house told you in Patrick's speech? Well, because it is, first of all. We should try to correct the reality of our society and work with the reality of our society. But also, it affects the broader perception of these racial minorities. Why? Because suddenly the government has changed policy and it said disadvantage is no longer linked to race. How do you think that the majority is now going to regard endemic disadvantage in minority communities? They're going to say, that's the problem of that minority community. They got themselves there, they keep themselves there, and we wash our hands of it. That's the problem. And that's the kind of thing that means you get welfare denied to minority groups. That's the kind of thing that means you don't see schools opening more often. That's the kind of thing where you don't see good teachers and good doctors going to those communities or indeed coming out of those communities. Race remains a reality in our society. The wheels that they're talking about have lifted countless thousands of people from racial minorities out of poverty, out of disadvantage, and out of hopelessness. We aim to protect that.
I would like to thank the speaker for her remarks and call upon the extension speaker to finish.
It was funny that both Tim and Ron pointed out the Bumi Putra policy in Malaysia as a shining example for race-based politics. If one were to scour the world and if one were to find the most horrendous piece of legislation ever to be introduced to mankind, the Bumi Putra policy would be right up there among them. In their entire attempt to construct a post-racial narrative that would help the disadvantaged ethnic minorities in these countries, trying to perpetuate race-based politics isn't the best way forward. We think it was a clever piece of rhetoric coming from both speakers when they tried to just highlight the idea that blacks and Hispanics are the ones contributing to their developing their own new generations of scholars in the future. We think that's not the reality at all. Considering the status quo, where there's an upsurge of racism in the South, right, where people are calling Barack Obama by his middle name Hussein, where the Tea Party is going out there and calling for their country back from the foreigners, we think that race is an issue, and what we need to do will be my extension today, which is to break the veil of euphemism that has shrouded public discourse on racism, and how exactly do we reconstruct the political narrative to help them all. But before that, a couple of rebuttals, right? The first rebuttal coming from the first argument coming from Braun, right, this concept that you're preventing the blacks and Hispanics from trying to cultivate a generation of new successors in the next few years. Here's the deal, right? If you recognize that the blacks and the Hispanics are entrenched in poverty and aren't doing so well, this means that the class of elites that they have is in the minority. Isn't that much anyway? And we don't want that minority to be the sole source of resources to develop future classes of blacks and Hispanics. We think if you have their best interests at heart, you need to open the kind of resources that should be made available to them, and you should implement our policy where you disallow the wills that discriminate and prioritize on the basis of race. Because we don't think that hoping that the small elite class of blacks and Hispanics can possibly save the new generations of blacks and Hispanics in the future. The second argument, right, this concept of unequal societies coming from them. And I have two responses to that. The first response is it's just not true. If you look at the American South, right, look at the big wills coming from the rich white people. They're primarily going to white schools, white public schools kids, and white private clubs. We don't think what they're talking about is necessarily true because the wealth amongst the black community is rather small and minimal, right? It affects majorities and the rich majorities specifically. Now, even if you accept, right, Tim's argument, that even if most of the money is predominantly occupied by the whites, we think that's especially harmful because of the kind of resentment that it creates, right? The kind of narrative that it perpetuates, where the blacks feel slighted because the whites keep giving money back to themselves, and the whites seeing the kind of siege mentality that has preoccupied and shrouded the ethnic minorities that exist in that country, where they keep trying to prop up their own people. We think the perpetuation of such race-based politics is particularly bad. The second reason, right, we think that if you are serious about breaking this cycle, what we basically need to do is ensure that the discourse that's been happening right now, where people are using euphemisms to detract and shy away from actually talking about the racial problems that is affecting the country, that what we need to do is break the veil of euphemism that currently exists. Well, whilst we understand, right, and this is coming to my substantive, whilst we understand that the US has evolved much from the kind of Jim Crow laws that engulf the South, and like, people point to the installation of a black president as like the paragon of racial reconciliation, we think that the undercurrent of racism that threatens to engulf the South and like to many countries across Europe is as real as ever, right? What do we see right now? We see the Tea Party shouting out that, they're ruled by a foreigner, a Muslim prince, and they want their country back. We see pieces of legislation like the Arizona law that openly discriminates against people who they think look suspicious, i.e. people who are Hispanics, people who are black. And we think, right, this points out to the kind of upsurge of racism that's not as tangible and outright as you see before under the Jim Crow laws of the South, but something that's as insidious and is particularly destructive of the kind of political narrative that we want to construct, right? What's been happening right now? Once you cloak it with euphemisms, right, with things, for example, going up there and saying, like, he doesn't belong to the United States or he looks suspicious. What happens is that Middle America and the people in the middle of the political spectrum will be slowly won over by the kind of rhetoric that they're talking about, right? Because people aren't really into like in-depth academic discussions. I'll take you in a minute, Kelly. What they basically do is that they link one with another. When they see a black president out there, and like Fox News, right, people in business suits and Colgate smiles, not people with like white socks over their faces, right? But people who actually look as though they're earning a decent amount of living, right? Go up there and drawing up this kind of links for them. That is not the kind of links that they immediately accept to be true and the kind of things that they perpetuate in society. But I kind of promised, Kelly.
If you think these charities are such bastions of evil, why are you allowing living people to donate to them in the first place?
We don't think that charities are bastions of evil. What we think is evil is that when you try to perpetuate race-based politics, when you allow people to prioritize certain groups over others for no other reason besides the irrational concept and basis of race. We think that's particularly harmful. We don't think the charities per se are harmful. So how exactly do we break this veil of euphemism? Because when you let the courts disallow people from making such wills, right, what you basically do is that you're allowing the courts to stop people not just from oppression from a state, but a kind of social, systemic oppression coming from private individuals that we think is particularly harmful, right? We understand one thing. We are going to incite the most extreme reaction from these people because we are encroaching onto something that is extremely and deeply personal for them, right? What basically happens to your wealth after you die. And that's exactly what we want to cultivate and exactly what we want to provoke. We want to bring the discourse back up into society to show them, right, that the racism that exists is still very prevalent, that the courts actually have to step in and stop such racist politics from even perpetuating in the first place. We want to thrust discourse back into the fold, force and compel people to call a spade, and not get them shy away with the kind of euphemisms that has shrouded public discourse like on racism in the world today. So why is this particularly good? Because we think that once you attack their grief, right, because we think it's especially important, because racism in this modern society where people pride themselves to be liberals who are particularly accepting of other differences, who are particularly accepting of other ethnic minorities, these examples of racism is particularly highlighted when you die, right? It's like, for example, in these instances, where you choose to have your wealth donated to a specific group purely based on your race. We think that's exactly where we need to attack, and we think that's exactly the way we get the most kind of critical reaction to push through the fact that that the post-racial world that you're talking about is not as healthy as it is, and we compel people to talk about it again and really construct the kind of post-racial narrative that we think is beneficial. For these reasons, I'm extremely proud to propose.
I would like to take the speaker for his remarks and invite the member of opposition to approach the podium to speak the case in their side
Mr. Speaker, we agree with our opening team that the vast majority of these charities and organisations are incredibly good and that they do incredibly good things across the world, specifically for minorities who are often forgotten by their governments. The problem here is that even if there are some evil organisations out there that do perpetuate this racism, you have a problem because you've set up your burden in today's debate as removing this, as normalising away from discrimination. But the only thing you're doing is stopping people from passing on their inheritance. You haven't stopped these organisations from existing at all, but you also haven't proved why stopping inheritance, will undermine these organisations at all either, guys. So we would like to see that an answer from closing. So I want to ask about two things in my rebuttal. Firstly, what impact do these organisations have now? And secondly, does this change race-based politics across the world? So firstly, what impacts do these organisations have now? And we agree with our opening team that predominantly these organisations are incredibly good, specifically for minorities who are often left out of the debate within government because they're minorities, because they have less lobby groups. But what we would say is that it does not perpetuate segregation as was suggested by Pat, because the blacks go to one university and the whites go to another. Often these scholarships are specifically for enfranchising black people to get into universities that they otherwise could not afford because Ivy Leagues are so damn expensive. No, thank you. But also what we would say is that it doesn't play into stereotypes at all, but even if it does, you don't change that, right? You don't change the capacity of these organisations to influence discourse, because these organisations get money from lobbyists, these organisations get money from individual donations, and you're not changing that. Secondly, does this change race-based politics? Like, we think it is pretty big of you to say that because people can't donate to the NAACP after they're dead anymore, that organisation isn't going to exist. These organisations are very powerful. They have lobbyists behind them, they have private individuals behind them, and they're obviously going to exist anyway. But even if that was the case, we think the only discourse you create is one where minorities feel that they are targeted. Why? Because obviously they are minorities. So when white or black people donate to mainstream or majority kinds of organisations that cater for the majority, of which the majority of people are white, obviously this minority is disenfranchised because you're not targeting anymore, and we think that they're going to have a problem with that. So, what do I want to do in extension? What I want to do is go over the efficacy of this model in detail and examine the stakeholders. And I'll be giving you some new information in extension under that. I have three main stakeholders that I want to look at. Those who are donating this money, those like the government as my second one, and secondly, the charities themselves and what they do if your model is implemented. Yes, Paul?
When a black or white billionaire excludes Hispanics from their will, why is it enough for us to wait in hope until a Hispanic billionaire comes along, rather than reallocate according to need from the start?
Okay, here is the problem that you have in today's debate. We do not think that you are going to be allocating these funds very well to begin with. This is my substantive material. Let's look at the black or white millionaire who is donating, those who are donating. Firstly, we think that our opening has already given you a pretty good reason why what they're going to do, instead of just let the government have free reign over the millions of dollars that they're lending, that they're leaving behind, they're just going to donate it to their family because they recognise that they can't activate change anymore. Or secondly, and here's a problem that you haven't thought of yet, Paul, they're just going to give these organisations the money before they die. Okay? So, the NAACP is just going to get people to give them their money on their deathbeds, right? It's not very difficult. But what we would say is that there is a massive problem with that, because often with these wills, they're often with trust groups, and the individual has control over their money. And when we accept then Rooney's analysis about why individuals should have control over their money because it is their will, because they have worked really hard for it, we think that these people are actually enfranchised better than just giving a blank check to them while they're alive. They can put it in their will that they want it specifically to be spent on this policy in particular. But secondly, the government. We think that there is a massive problem with your model because at the moment you're going to give this allocation of funds to people who need protection the most. That sounds nice, but let's think about how that actually plays out in the real world. These organisations still exist, right? So either what you're doing is you're having a situation where you won't allow individuals to donate directly to these organisations. What you're going to do is pool it and then divvy it out again to these charities. Because obviously some of these charities should get a little bit of money. Now obviously you're going to give some to the black people, some to the white people, some to the other minorities, right? But there is a problem here because you are still giving the money in the first place. And if these organisations are perverting political discourse to the extent that our CG wants to tell us, the government is still giving them this money. But also we think that the process of allocation is particularly problematic. Why? Because we think that it will be highly politicised. And as we've already said, it is very hard for governments to target minorities specifically, often because the majority isn't happy for it, just within normal policy, right? So this policy will be highly political, but it's also going to be highly bureaucratic. And we think that when we're looking at the kind of organisations that we've had brought out as examples in opening. Organisations that should exist and do a lot of good for a lot of people's lives. They shouldn't have to wait, but moreover, they shouldn't get less than what they already deserve. But also what we have is that in terms of the role of the state, we have just anti-discrimination laws and that kind of thing. We think all you're doing is playing this out in a different arena at the end of the day. But thirdly and finally, the charities. No, thank you. We have two prongs here. Firstly, we think that you haven't banned these charities to begin with, and these organisations have a right to exist because they have a fundamental right to help people, and that is like their mandate, right? But they also have to compete against others. But secondly, we think that in terms of these charities, because we allow them to exist, because the vast majority of cases they do very good things, we think here, individuals who are dead are using this money as like a particular form of freedom of speech here, because they are dead, but they do have community, and they do have people that they sympathise with, right? So if we look to examples like the NAACP or other things, like they lobby for particular outcomes in society, and if that individual wants those outcomes to be actuated, we are quite happy for them to happen. But the individual has an invested interest here that the government doesn't have, and the government cannot possibly advocate for that individual interest because they don't know about it, but also because they don't come from that minority to begin with. So like you stand in today's debate happy to give no one the ability to give money to the Maori Party, which we think does incredibly good things in New Zealand as a private actor. Mr. Speaker, these organisations exist and we allow them to, and we think that is fundamentally correct because they do really good things. But even if we didn't think even if they were the evil bastions of like political discourse in today's debate, we think that ultimately what we have to accept is that it is much better that individuals give directly than the government divvies up for them.
I would like to thank the speaker for her remarks and call upon the Dr. Witt to close the case for proposition 19.
The funny thing about that speech is that a large part of the extension is based on this idea that if people want to be racist, they can find other ways to be racist. They can give it to people when they're alive, they can give it to their families instead. We say fine, definitely, there are ways to circumscribe laws, and it's the court's role to ensure that these things don't happen. But the fact of the matter is that when it does happen, when the rule explicitly says that this money should only go to white country clubs, why should the court not have a role in stepping in to stop it? That's the answer. We have never ever the extension does not deal with the crux of this issue at all. I'm going to look at two things. Firstly, the court's role and the state's role with regards to the rights of the dead, and secondly, the issue of social equity and the post-racial world, right? The two big issues in this debate. To the first, the issue of the court's role here. Now, I'm going to deal with the opening opposition's gap here, that people work for this money, they feel attached to certain racial groups, and as such, after they have died, the state has no role in infringing on where the money goes. On the first level, we say that the state always infringes on the rights of the dead, more so than the living. The dead's rights are often diminished, ladies and gentlemen. The fact that a transfer of cash is often scrutinized and a state tax exists that testifies to this. But even the most fundamental rights of the dead, to be buried, is also an important point. Burial places are often overhauled for the sake of social movement, of building buildings and things like that. So this idea that the dead deserve the same rights as the living simply doesn't exist. And our idea is that the rights of the dead often give way to social instruments, as a means of social instruments to advance other social groups. Social goals. That is why this thing is so important. That's why even though we may allow them to donate when they're alive, when they're dead, their rights are subsumed under this idea of social goals, ladies and gentlemen. This idea that large social goals, that we need to combat this idea of race-based politics and racism. That is very, very important. Even the idea of things like targeting employment practices in the Civil Rights Act in real life should also extend into the dead. Even more, it should extend to the dead. That's the point we've been trying to make, ladies and gentlemen. On the second level, we say the court, as it stands now in real life, also governs racism with regards to how government cannot treat individuals differently on the basis of race. Right? Even the Roberts Court recently had moved on to target affirmative action policies on the basis that it discriminates on the basis of race. We do not see why when they can target the state's role in discrimination, why they can't target individuals, especially dead individuals, in terms of their attitude to race. On the issue of attachment, we still can flip the coin as well. Certain people feel attached to certain racial groups, but a white person feels privileged and thinks, I've made it in life because I am white, and therefore I want to reward that white community. We don't think that's a legitimate attitude that a state should enforce, and we think the rights of the dead can be subsumed for the sake of this particular social group. So let's then move on to the second issue, because that's been a preoccupying concern that's at the house, right? The issue of social equity, the post-racial future.
First and foremost, the extensions. The idea firstly
Point,
that
sir.
they'll give to families anyway if they're not allowed to be racist in the case. But first and foremost, we say giving to their families is still preferable to giving them to institutions that
Point, sir.
perpetuate this particular racism in societies, ladies and gentlemen. It is at least the least bad alternative. The second idea is that they can give money to bits and pieces to different organizations anyway. Well, no, they can't. That's the point. They can only give it to organizations that do not discriminate on race. This is not the debate at all. And the third idea is that it's often hard for governments to reach specific minority groups, and therefore, because of this, you should allow individuals to do it. Like first and foremost, right, they are waiting and assuming that enough individuals
Point,
do this to build sufficient infrastructure to help minority groups in the first place. But secondly, and more importantly, that is not the point. We are not saying we're distributing this to specific minority groups. We're saying we're distributing this to non-racially based institutions because we believe HAPS should be needs-based and not race-based. That is
Point, sir.
particularly important. So the extension, a total non-starter. Let's then move on to the other point, right? This idea that black colleges, the individual minority billionaires want to help members of their own communities. On the first level,
Point, sir.
they've never engaged with the idea that the number of black millionaires or Hispanic millionaires are small in the first place. The resources they are able to
Point,
provide.
sir.
That's something that's ran through the entire proposition bench that they've never once engaged with. But let's engage with them anyway. On the first level, we challenge their context. We challenge this idea that this idea of discriminatory practices from whites to blacks or majority groups to minority groups is very
Point, sir.
We don't think so. We think especially in Wales is where the inbuilt racism amongst black people of the American South or throughout post-liberal democracies is actually at its most invidious because they have to show society that they're racist.
Point,
Like
sir.
social pleasures stop them from being racist in real life, but often when they are dead, that is where their racism actually surfaces. That's when they donate money to white middle class, ladies and gentlemen. Secondly, they have not engaged in much contextualization that in many first world countries right now, racism against specific minority groups, against blacks, against Hispanics is on the upsurge. That's something
Point,
they
sir.
never
Point,
once
sir.
challenged. But let's take them the opening opposition, no, not yet, on their context anyway, right? They say the organizations like La Raza, black colleges are good for minority groups and we should insist in their perpetuation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be bold here. The fact of the matter is that the perpetuation of these race-based groups has been one of the main factors in
Point,
impediments to uplift, until closing later, to uplift in this particular instance, to uplift in terms of integrating society. These black colleges that we're talking about here, we produce individual stars, but by and large, people who study in black colleges do not really make it in life. That is the point, ladies and gentlemen. They are incubators of the analysis and the stereotype that a black person who reads is trying to act white. Their idea that these black colleges are somehow good for their community simply does not do that. This is exactly where the community comes in. We want to ensure that money is distributed to non-racial organizations and minority groups can also benefit from non-racial organizations. Racial organizations are the very placebo effect that prevents majorities from happening because they think the minorities already have their own lobby groups, their own protectors, ladies and gentlemen. That is precisely the problem. Closing.
Do you think that a pre-civil rights American government would have equally divvied up dead black people's money?
No, but this is a post-civil rights American government. That's precisely organizations, right? They are not racially based, and we think that is the best possible path for the future. The last point here is the idea of resentment and backlash. So when I even build on the extension coming out from here only, this idea that there will be a backlash from those who are racist, even if we agree that it's not a post-racial America or post-racial future. We think this backlash is entirely what we need, right? That's the extension they never once dealt with here. That if people are unhappy because of this policy, because they can't donate to people who are white, and they come out and actually say so, you tear away this veil, the society is no longer racist. You send a clear message to society that racism is still prevalent, that this law is something that people still oppose. That is precisely how you shift this discourse away from the euphemisms that currently dominate political culture right now, and ensure that people actually deal with the issues square in the head. There is racism, there's the prevalent social attitudes that are racist, and this needs to be changed. I think this policy can draw attention to that particular attitude that's currently enshrouded in euphemism, and I think that's critically important in moving the racial conversation toward in the future in all the post-liberal democracies that we want to talk about. So holistically, ladies and gentlemen, we have shown you that the right of it can be subsumed for the sake of social goals, and secondly, in terms of social goals, we better achieve this idea of social equity and a post-racial future. We are proud to propose.
I would like to thank the speaker for his remarks and call upon the opposition whip to approach the front and close the entire debate.
Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, Kelly's POI, the point wasn't about pre-American civil rights movement. The point is that you're letting the government decide which minorities are getting the money. And that can be perverted for a range of reasons. It could be because you have a government, like in India, which favours certain castes over others. It could be because there's a political benefit for trying to give money to poor Hispanics because they don't vote as much towards Democrats as poor blacks. The point is you're not letting an individual decide anymore, an individual who has the freedom, according to them, to give money to these organisations when alive, just not when dead, ladies and gentlemen. You're giving the money to the government, and there's a harm in that. So I've got 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, why this is invalid and it's inappropriate for the role of government to limit money to these companies or these charities at the moment. Secondly, I'll be looking at how you get equality, and thirdly, whether this perpetuates racism. So this first point about the right of association. What Kelly gave you very clearly, ladies and gentlemen, is that people are able to give this money, should be able to give this money to charities. It's a form of speech, ladies and gentlemen, to give money. We stand very proudly for the fact that the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, or the NAACP, should be able to receive money from dead African Americans who want that organisation to continue to lobby for change and outcomes. That's money that they're not going to get under your side. Because unfortunately, we're actually not sure whether we are living in a post-race society, as the opening government said, or whether we're living in a society where it's just no longer post-racial, as the closing said. We're not entirely sure which one we're living in. But either way, we still think we need the NAACP to be lobbying for money. We also told you, ladies and gentlemen, that because of their model is not stopping these associations getting money when you're alive. There's nothing to stop people giving money to the NAACP before they die, or giving money to racially based charities before they die, if that's not what they want to do. And the harm there is that those individuals lose control of that money. Because when you have a will, you can set up a trust, ladies and gentlemen, which uses the interest on capital to give scholarships and give money. But if you're forced to just give a big check of money to someone before you die, you lose control of how that organisation spends that money. So we think there's a harm there. The only response we got from closing on that is that we can construct laws to stop that happening. But you are never stopping people giving money to these organisations in the first place, or stopping these organisations from existing. So we didn't really get how that would happen. Moreover, we had this idea that people's rights are subsumed once they're dead, therefore the state can do this. Then why do we allow people to have wills at all, ladies and gentlemen? The will says that people still have rights when they die and still should be able to do that. Your rights are not subsumed. That's the reason we have wills all over. But moreover, you're still letting people, as Pat wanted to talk about, give money to their cats. Like, you're not taking control of what people are doing. And if you really thought the rights were subsumed and to be used for the good of society, why are you taking all the money instead of just taking a very small amount of the money? No, thank you. So, because our extension told you that these people, that the government can't advocate for the interests of these individuals to the same extent that these individuals can, because the government isn't the best arbiter in today's debate, but in fact those individuals, we're very proud to say that people should continue to have a right of association. Moving on to the second point about equality, ladies and gentlemen. We have this idea that, you know, for someone like for someone like Warren Buffett, rather, it's a marginal call when they give billions of dollars, whether it goes to blacks or whites. Look, maybe that's the case because he's white and a pretty good guy, but for the majority of people, ladies and gentlemen, we think it's not a marginal call, it's one of the reasons they're giving money. Oprah Winfrey, for example, ladies and gentlemen, will probably want to give a lot of money to black-specific charities when she passes away, because she's done so much work with helping the African-American community in terms of giving, in terms of helping them, ladies and gentlemen. Or the Tatars in India, ladies and gentlemen, might want to help out a specific caste that they came from. So we think it's perfectly valid for those people to do that. We don't think it's a marginal call. Moreover, what we brought you an extension, ladies and gentlemen, is that you're pooling and then reallocating this money. So you're still going to inevitably have to give some money to these racial charities. We heard at closing that, no, that's not the case, we'll just give it in general. But the point is not acknowledging that we're not living in some post-racial society. African Americans still have more disadvantage, ladies and gentlemen. The Maori Party exists in New Zealand to lobby for improvements for Maoris. These people need money. You're just allocating in general, you're not helping the problem. Because here's the thing. If you have, ladies and gentlemen, a poor Brahmin, because that's an Indian caste, which is quite well off, and a poor Dalit, ladies and gentlemen, we think that it's valid for more money to go to the Dalit, ladies and gentlemen, because you need that person to be advanced to further and perpetuate that social group. You'd support AA in that situation. You guys aren't doing that at all, so you're actually perpetuating the very sort of race-based politics you're in, because you're leaving people in the dirt, ladies and gentlemen. Moreover, we told you that this process is going to be highly politicized. There's going to be incredibly bureaucratic. And it's going to be beholden to the sort of minorities that are au fait with the media at the time, ladies and gentlemen. I've already told you about how we're going to be looking at things like, you know, money might be going to the Hispanics or the black community instead, and I'll take opening.
Even if your extension matched up with the debate, billionaires by and large want to stay billionaires while they're alive. When they're dead, and the question is about how to allocate their estate, why should not the state push them in the direction of allocating that money to the most
Because
needy?
billionaires are tad, if they care enough about the cause, will get the money when they're alive, or they'll do what I already said and just give it to their children and not worry about it and let the children be the philanthropists. So our third and final point about how this perpetuates racism, ladies and gentlemen. We didn't really particularly think that, so firstly, we had this idea that it perpetuates race-based politics because white Americans just give money to white causes and black Americans give causes to black causes. Firstly, we don't think that that's a particularly sophisticated analysis of what's happening at the moment, ladies and gentlemen. Most whites don't care anymore because don't give money just to white charities because most people aren't racist. I think that's a pretty good operating presumption here that most people in the world are not racist. Some people may be, ladies and gentlemen, but it's over the fact that some racist whites will give money to whites only. It's far outweighed by the fact that there are more people who give money specifically to blacks. That's why you have vastly more African American scholarships than you do white-only scholarships at the major unis. I can't think of any Ivy League uni which has a white-only scholarship, ladies and gentlemen. There are plenty which have African American. Moreover, the idea that it's somehow visible, ladies and gentlemen, is ridiculous. Wills are unseen, so you're not going to see where the money goes. So it's hardly going to be an obvious divider of communities in this case. But moreover, we don't think that the whites are going to be giving the money in this case. And moreover, we think it's in fact important that money goes specifically to African American groups, or to the Dalits in India, or to the Maori Party, because those are groups which desperately need the money because they're societally at a disadvantage. So then to today's debate, what we've told you is that because there are still structural disadvantages and reasons certain minorities are discriminated against, we need to give money to programs that give money specifically to those groups. We need to give money specifically to the Dalits over the Brahmins. We need to give money specifically to the Maori Party. But moreover, it is absolutely an individual's right to choose where their money goes, because money is a form of speech. It's something they've earned and accrued over their hard working life, and it's not something for the government to arbitrarily and indiscriminately flitter away, because the government is not the best arbiter in this debate. The government is beholden to certain interests and vested interests, which will ensure that money doesn't go to the way that that individual wants to use. So because, ladies and gentlemen, it is wrong to in fact use the government instead of these individuals' interests, we are proud to oppose.